The night of April 21st, 1453, settled over the Bosphorus like a held breath. A thin fog rolled in from the water, wrapping itself around the base of Constantinople's ancient walls, softening the torchlight of the sentries posted along the Golden Horn's northern shore. The air smelled of salt and cold stone, and something else, something metallic and faintly animal, like wet rope and tallow, though the guard on the wall couldn't quite place it. He stamped his feet against the chill, adjusted the weight of his spear, and looked out across the dark water below. The Golden Horn lay still. The great chain stretched across its mouth, invisible now in the darkness, but present in his mind, the way a familiar prayer is present. Constant, reassuring, absolute. Nothing moved on the water. Nothing ever moved on the water on the Golden Horn side. That was the whole point. He was not a professional soldier. Few of the men on these walls were, not anymore. He was a baker's apprentice who had been handed a spear 6 days after his 20th birthday, and told that the fate of the world depended on men like him holding men like him in place. He believed it. Everyone inside these walls believed it, in the particular way that people believe things when the alternative is unthinkable. Constantinople had stood for 1,123 years. It had been attacked more than 20 times. It had never fallen from the outside. The walls saw to that. He looked north, toward the dark ridgeline of Galata Hill, the neutral Genoese district that rose above the far bank of the Golden Horn. Nothing there either. Just shadows and the occasional wink of distant torchlight from the colony's own fortifications. He yawned. He pulled his cloak tighter. And then he saw it. Not on the water, on the hill. Torches, moving. Not the stationary glow of a watchtower, but moving torches. Dozens of them, then more, crawling over the crest of the Galata Ridge and descending toward the far shore of the Golden Horn. And beneath the torches, in the flickering amber light, enormous shapes. Dark, angular, wrong. Ships. Ships moving over dry land. Ships descending a hillside like a slow avalanche of timber and sail and oar, sliding through the darkness on some impossible surface, flanked by thousands of silent men. The great chain of the Golden Horn, the chain that had protected this harbour for centuries, the chain that was the spine of Constantinople's entire northern defence, lay stretched and useless across the water far to his left. Below it, behind it, irrelevant. He screamed for the alarm bell. Inside Constantinople, in the narrow streets between crumbling churches and empty mansions, and the vast open fields that had once been crowded neighbourhoods, the bell began to ring. It rang with a sound that everyone who heard it would remember for the rest of their lives, however short those lives turned out to be. It was not the sound of danger. Danger had been ringing for 46 days already. This was the sound of something else entirely. This was the sound of the impossible becoming real. 7,000 men defending 14 miles of wall. 80,000 outside wanting in. 26 ships against 140. A city of 40,000 souls facing the largest army the medieval world had ever assembled in one place. These were the numbers that defined the spring of 1453, and they were already catastrophic enough. But Mehmed II, Sultan of the Ottomans, 21 years old and burning with the particular fury of a young man who has decided that the world owes him a miracle, had just added a new number to the equation: 70. 70 ships dragged over a mountain in a single night, now floating in the waters that Constantinople's defenders had believed, with absolute certainty, with a faith bordering on religion, could never be reached. The Middle Ages did not end with a battle. They ended with an idea. With one man's refusal to accept that the word impossible meant what everyone else thought it meant. They ended when ships sailed over mountains, when the oldest city in the Christian world woke up on an April morning to find that the rules of reality had been quietly rewritten during the night. What happened in the 53 days between April 6th and May 29th, 1453, was not simply the fall of a city. It was the collision of two worlds. One built on steel and stone and 1,000 years of accumulated certainty. The other built on gunpowder and will, and the terrifying logic of a man who had decided that nothing was fixed. When the smoke cleared, one world was gone. The other one is still with us. To understand why one city mattered so much, why its loss sent shockwaves from the courts of Italy to the monasteries of Russia, why a pope wept openly, and a Venetian merchant threw himself into the sea upon hearing the news, you have to understand what Constantinople actually was. Not what it had been at its peak, not the gilded fantasy of its own mythology, but what it actually was in the spring of 1453. Because the gap between those two things is one of history's great tragedies. And it is the gap that made everything that followed inevitable. At its height, in the 6th century under Justinian, Constantinople had been the largest city in the Western world. 400,000 people lived within its walls. Its harbour was the crossroads of every major trade route connecting Europe to Asia. Its libraries held the accumulated intellectual inheritance of Greece and Rome. Its churches were so encrusted with gold mosaic that visitors from the northern forests of Europe reportedly wept at the sight of them, convinced they had stumbled into heaven itself. The city sat at the precise geographic hinge between two continents, commanding the Bosphorus Strait, the narrow channel connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, with the casual authority of a giant resting its hand on a door. Whoever held Constantinople held the throat of the world's commerce. But that was then. By 1453, the Black Death had swept through the city twice, leaving entire neighborhoods empty. The economy had collapsed in slow motion across 2 centuries of Ottoman encirclement. The magnificent population of 400,000 had dwindled to somewhere between 40 and 50,000. And even that number was misleading, because thousands of those people were living in what amounted to walled villages inside the larger city, separated from each other by vast open fields, where grain now grew inside the ancient fortifications. Walking from one inhabited quarter to another in Constantinople in 1453 meant passing through stretches of emptiness that would have been recognizable to a farmer in Burgundy. The great city had hollowed out from the inside, leaving behind its magnificent shell. What remained, though, was the shell itself. And what a shell it was. The Theodosian walls had been built in the 5th century and had never been successfully breached from the outside. Not once in 1,000 years. They ran for nearly 4 miles across the western land approach to the city, the only direction from which a land army could attack, since water protected everything else. And they were not simply walls in the way that the word implies a single barrier. They were a system. A 60-foot wide moat filled with water sat at the front. Behind the moat,
an outer wall, crenellated, studded with towers every 45 to 55 meters. Behind that, an open terrace. Behind the terrace, the great inner wall, 40 feet high and 15 feet thick, with towers rising even higher at regular intervals. Any army that somehow crossed the moat still faced the outer wall.
Any army that took the outer wall still faced the inner one. The towers provided overlapping fields of fire in every direction. For 1,000 years, this system had been, quite simply, the most effective defensive architecture in existence. And then there was the Golden Horn. The Golden Horn was a natural inlet that curved north from the Bosphorus into the body of the city, forming the northern boundary of the main peninsula. It was Constantinople's harbour, its lifeline, its secondary defensive barrier. To seal it against enemy navies, the Byzantines had long used a massive iron chain, stretched across the mouth of the inlet from a tower on the city walls to a tower in the Genoese colony of Galata on the opposite bank. The chain floated on log and iron pontoons, each one measuring 20 by 15 meters, and the mechanism that operated it was a masterwork of Byzantine engineering. Pulleys, wheels, counterweights, all working together to raise or lower the barrier as needed. When the chain was up, no ship could enter the Golden Horn. The northern sea walls of Constantinople, which were considerably thinner than the land walls, were thus protected by water rather than stone. It was a system that had worked perfectly for centuries. The problem in 1453 was the men available to defend it. Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos had ascended to what remained of the Byzantine throne in 1449, inheriting an empire that consisted of the city itself, a handful of Aegean islands, and the Peloponnese Peninsula in Greece. He was a soldier by temperament and training, lean, bearded, relentlessly energetic, and in another age, in another empire, he might have been a great ruler. He walked the walls himself at night. He knew every section of the fortifications, every weak point, every place where the ancient mortar was crumbling. He had spent his first years on the throne doing exactly what an emperor should do in a crisis: begging, pleading, negotiating, and writing letters to anyone in Christian Europe who might help. The letters went largely unanswered. France and England were exhausted from the 100 Years' War, which had ground on for more than a century and was only now sputtering to an end. Hungary had been decimated at the Battle of Varna 9 years earlier, trying to break Ottoman power in the Balkans. The Holy Roman Empire was tied up in its own internal struggles. The Pope, Pope Nicholas V, was genuinely sympathetic, but his influence over secular monarchs was far less than he or anyone else liked to pretend. He sent 3 ships with provisions. He sent Cardinal Isidore with 200 archers. It was a gesture, not a rescue. Venice deliberated and deliberated. The Senate voted in February 1453 to send a relief fleet. The fleet was still being assembled in April. It would never arrive in time. What Constantine actually had on the walls in April 1453 was approximately 7,000 men. 5,000 of them were Byzantine Greeks, armed civilians, militia, men who had been handed weapons because there was no one else to hand weapons to. The remaining 2,000 were foreign volunteers, Venetians who happened to be in the city when the siege began and chose to stay, a small force of Catalans, a contingent of Cretans, and a crucial reinforcement that had arrived in January. 700 professional soldiers from Genoa, under the command of a man named Giovanni Giustiniani Longo. Giustiniani was the reason Constantinople lasted 53 days instead of 5. He was a specialist. In an age before military engineering had a formal title, Giustiniani was what you would call a siege warfare expert, a man who had spent his career studying the defense and reduction of fortified positions, who understood the mathematics of walls and gates and artillery angles with the same intuitive fluency that a musician understands harmony. Constantine gave him overall command of the land wall defences immediately upon his arrival, and Giustiniani rewarded that trust by turning the western approaches into something that would confound the most powerful army in the medieval world for nearly 2 months. But even Giustiniani could not conjure soldiers from thin air. 7,000 men defending 14 miles of walls meant that any given section was dangerously undermanned. Every man mattered. Every position was critical. There was no reserve. There was no margin for error. And into this fragile situation walked the most dangerous weapon in human history up to that point, carried in pieces on the backs of 60 oxen across 300 miles of rough road. His name was Orban, and he was Hungarian, and he had arrived at the court of Emperor Constantine XI in early 1452 with an offer that should have changed everything. He was a cannon founder, one of the small internationally mobile fraternity of technical mercenaries who were transforming warfare across Europe with a volatile mixture of bronze, saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal. He could build cannons, not the small, unreliable devices that armies had been experimenting with for the past century. Real cannons, enormous ones, weapons on a scale that the world had not yet seen. He told Constantine that with sufficient resources, he could build a gun that would tear down any wall in existence. Constantine told him that the treasury was empty. He was sorry. Perhaps if Orban came back in a year or 2. Orban came back 6 months later. He came back to a different audience, to a young man who was never going to tell anyone that the treasury was empty, because the treasury was never the real limitation. The real limitation was imagination, and Mehmed II had no limitations of that kind whatsoever. Mehmed paid Orban 4 times his asking rate. He provided him with a foundry at Adrianople, unlimited raw materials, and a workforce of hundreds of skilled labourers. He told Orban to build the biggest cannon the world had ever seen, and then he told him to build several more. What emerged from Orban's foundry in the winter of 1452 to 1453 was 27 feet of bronze horror. The barrel walls were 8 inches thick. The bore was 30 inches in diameter, wide enough for a man to crawl into on his hands and knees. The projectile it fired was a stone ball weighing somewhere between 1,200 and 1,500 pounds. When it discharged, the sound could be heard 10 miles away. The ground shook for a distance that contemporary accounts describe as great, and modern estimates place at somewhere around a mile. It required 200 men to operate. It took 2 hours to reload. When it fired, it was like a small earthquake, announcing itself with light and noise. 60 oxen dragged it to Constantinople over 300 miles of road that had been reinforced specifically for the purpose. 10,000 men surrounded it and assisted in its transport. It sat in front of Mehmed's own red and gold pavilion when the siege began, pointed directly at the Gate of St. Romanus, the centre of the Theodosian wall's longest stretch. The weapon that could have saved Constantinople had been offered to Constantinople first. The man who built it had stood in the throne room and extended the offer with his own hands. Constantinople couldn't afford it. Mehmed could afford anything. Stand at the edge of the Bosphorus on the European side and look west, and you are looking at the geometry that defined the siege. Behind you is Asia. In front of you is Constantinople, or rather the shape of what Constantinople used to be. Because in 1453, the city that had once sprawled magnificently across an entire peninsula had contracted into clusters of inhabited islands within a vast, overgrown emptiness. All of it surrounded by the ancient walls, like an old man still wearing the armour of his youth. The Theodosian walls close off the west. The Sea of Marmara closes off the south. The Bosphorus closes off the east. The Golden Horn closes off the north. A city entirely surrounded by barriers. A city with 4 faces and 4 different kinds of defence. This geography was everything. It was the reason Constantinople had survived 20 sieges. It was also the reason that Mehmed II had spent 2 years studying maps before he arrived, tracing the same lines with his finger over and over, asking the same questions in 6 languages to men who had visited the city, searching for the logic that would let him in. He found 3 of the 4 answers before the siege began. The Bosphorus shore was defended by the Ottoman fleet itself, 140 to 200 vessels assembled at the harbour of Diplokionion, a mile or so north of the city. The Marmara shore was defended by a combination of Ottoman naval patrols and the natural difficulty of landing a force on rocky coastline under fire. The western land approach was the obvious focus. This was where the great Theodosian walls stood. This was where Mehmed positioned his heaviest artillery and his best infantry. This was where the siege would ultimately be decided. He placed his own tent, red and gold, visible for miles, at the centre of the Ottoman line, directly opposite the Mesoteikion, the section of wall that crossed a shallow river valley and was therefore slightly lower and more vulnerable than the rest. The 4th face was the problem. The Golden Horn, with its great chain and its shallow northern sea walls, was theoretically the most vulnerable part of Constantinople's defences. The walls facing the harbour were older, thinner, and less formidable than the great land barriers to the west. If an attacker could get warships into the Golden Horn, they could approach those weaker walls directly, force the defenders to split their already inadequate forces between 2 fronts, and potentially find a way in that the western approach's defenders could not plug fast enough. But the chain stopped that. The chain stopped everything. It had always stopped everything. Mehmed placed Zaganos Pasha and a substantial force north of the Golden Horn from the start of the siege. Not just for show, but because he was already thinking about what came next if the chain couldn't be broken. Zaganos Pasha's job was partly to apply pressure from the north and partly to control the ridgeline of Galata Hill. That ridgeline would become important. On April 6th, Mehmed's army was in position. The force was extraordinary by any historical measure. Estimates range from 55,000 to 80,000 soldiers, though the larger numbers include non-combatants, support staff, and auxiliary forces of varying reliability. The corps was formidable. The Janissaries, the elite infantry corps, recruited as children from Christian families in the Balkans and raised from birth to be soldiers, were stationed at the centre, protecting the Sultan's person and ready to exploit any breach that the artillery created. The regular Anatolian and Rumelian troops stretched along the entire length of the land wall. Bashi Bazouk irregulars, fierce, poorly disciplined, and expendable, served as the first wave in any assault, intended to tire the defenders before the real attacks began. The artillery train was unlike anything Europe had assembled in one place. 12 great bombards of various sizes anchored the line, supplemented by 56 smaller cannon and an array of traditional trebuchets that continued to hurl projectiles in the ancient way even as their modern replacements thundered alongside them. Orban's great basilica sat in the place of honor before the Sultan's tent. 2 other large bombards flanked it. The combined weight of stone that this array could throw at the walls in a single day was measured in tons. The fleet at Diplokionion was commanded by Admiral Baltaoglu, a veteran sailor personally loyal to Mehmed, given explicit orders to prevent any relief ships from reaching the city and to find a way past the Great Chain. His 140-plus ships were a mixture of types: large war galleys, triremes, biremes, smaller fustae, light brigantines, horse transport barges, and supply vessels. The Ottoman fleet was not the equal of Venice's in seamanship or ship quality, but it vastly outnumbered anything Constantinople could put on the water, and its presence in the Bosphorus meant the city could not expect resupply from the sea. Inside the walls, Giustiniani had organized the defense with the precise, unsentimental logic of a man who knows he is working with inadequate material and intends to make the most of it anyway. He placed himself and his Genoese professionals at the Mesoteikion, the section Mehmed had targeted with his heaviest guns, and distributed the remaining forces along the land wall according to their quality and reliability. The Venetian captain Minotto held the Blakenai Palace section at the northern end of the land wall. Byzantine noble commanders held the middle sections. The Golden Horn sea wall was assigned to Grand Duke Notaras, the second highest official in the Byzantine government, who commanded the small fleet of Byzantine and Italian merchant vessels anchored behind the chain. The sea wall along the Marmara was parcelled out among Catalans, Greeks, and a unit of Ottoman Turks fighting for Byzantium, the exiled Prince Orhan and his followers, who understood exactly what capture by Mehmed II would mean for them. Constantine moved constantly. He had no reserve worth speaking of, so he became the reserve, riding or walking to wherever the pressure was heaviest, appearing at crisis points with the calm authority of a man who had decided, somewhere in the weeks before the siege began, that he was not going to survive it, but was going to make surviving it as expensive as possible for whoever killed him. The bombardment began on April 12th. Nothing that had existed before that morning prepared human beings for the sound of Orban's great bombard firing at full charge. An eyewitness wrote that there was first a terrifying roar and a violent shaking of the ground beneath and for a great distance around, and a din such as has never been heard. The stone ball, half a ton of marble quarried from the Black Sea coast and shaped to a rough sphere, travelled over a mile before striking the Theodosian wall at the gate of St. Romanus. Sections of the outer wall came down. The inner wall cracked. Dust rose in a column visible from the Asian shore. Mehmed, watching from horseback, smiled. The Byzantines had prepared for artillery. They had stuffed the space between the inner and outer walls with earth and rubble, creating a packed earthen fill that absorbed the shock of impact better than bare stone. They had gathered materials for rapid repair: timber, barrels of earth, woolen bales, and Giustiniani had organized work parties that began repairing damage every single night, so that each morning the guns had to redestroy what the defenders had rebuilt in darkness. It was a profound and exhausting system. It worked. Every morning, the wall was still there. Every morning, the guns had to start again. The psychological weight of this was immense, in both directions. For the defenders, the daily destruction and nightly repair became a kind of ritual, grinding, terrifying, but also oddly sustaining, because it proved that human effort could still answer the machine. For the attackers, the guns that had seemed like they would end the siege in days began to feel, in the second and third weeks, like something less than promised. On April 17th, Baltaoglu made his first serious attempt on the Great Chain. He drove his galleys toward the mouth of the Golden Horn with oars churning, trying to use speed and numbers to overwhelm the barrier and the small Byzantine fleet defending it. The Byzantine ships, merchant vessels reinforced with timber barriers, manned by men who understood their harbour better than any Ottoman sailor, met him with Greek fire and artillery and sheer, furious competence. Baltaoglu was driven back. He tried again. He was driven back again. He retreated north. Then, on April 20th, something happened that briefly lit the darkness inside Constantinople. 3 Genoese transport ships, sent by Pope Nicholas V with provisions for the city, and 1 large Byzantine grain carrier, had been windbound at the island of Chios. They finally arrived off Constantinople on that April morning, sails full, running before a strong southerly wind. Baltaoglu threw his entire fleet at them, hundreds of ships against 4. The Genoese sailors, with the high sides of their carracks towering over the Ottoman galleys, fought with everything they had. The Ottoman oar-powered vessels couldn't maintain position against the wind that drove the Christian ships. The galleys couldn't board the taller merchant vessels. For 2 hours, in full view of thousands of Byzantine citizens lining the sea walls, the 4 ships held off the entire Ottoman fleet. When the wind briefly died and the Ottoman ships finally managed to grapple with the Byzantine grain carrier, the Genoese lashed all 4 ships together and continued fighting as a single platform. The wind came back. The 4 ships broke free. They sailed past the Ottoman fleet, reached the chain, and were let through by the Byzantine defenders. Every person inside Constantinople watched it happen. The bells rang. People wept. For a few hours, the city's morale climbed to something approaching hope. Mehmet watched from the shore. He was so enraged that, according to one account, he rode his horse into the surf. He summoned Baltaoglu to his tent. He sentenced him to death, then commuted it, on the intercession of the Janissaries who had witnessed Baltaoglu fighting personally in the engagement, to 100 lashes, the stripping of all rank and possessions, and permanent exile. His replacement took command of the fleet the next morning, and Mehmed went back to his maps. 4 days later, 70 ships were in the Golden Horn. But before we get to the night that those ships crossed the hill, we should pause for a moment on the night before it. On the evening of April 21st, before anything moved, when the men who were about to do the impossible were still ordinary men standing in the dark. On the Byzantine side of the Golden Horn, the night watch on the sea wall was light. Most of the defenders were on the western land wall, where they were needed most. The men on the sea wall were older, or younger, or injured, or simply unlucky in the rotation that assigned posts. They had been watching the same dark water for 16 days. Nothing ever came from this direction. The chain guaranteed it. They talked quietly among themselves about the things men talk about when they're trying not to think about what's coming.
One of them, according to a later account, possibly embellished, possibly not, made a joke about Ottoman ships learning to fly. His companion told him to shut up. Someone was always making that joke. On the Ottoman side, in the shadow of Galata Hill, the silence was extraordinary for an army of that size. Mehmed had given specific orders. No drums, no shouting, no unnecessary movement. Thousands of men crouched in darkness, hands on ropes, shoulders against timber, waiting for the signal. The wooden road had been prepared during the preceding days, under cover of Zagano Pasha's forces. 3 miles of heavy planking laid across the hillside, each board coated in tallow, rendered from cattle fat. The smell was thick and animal, and oddly homely, the smell of cooking.
Somehow displaced into a context that had nothing to do with food. Mehmed sat on horseback at the crest of the hill. He had been there for an hour. He didn't speak. He looked at the dark water below, at the chain he couldn't break, at the city beyond it that he had been dreaming about since he was 13 years old. He nodded to the officer beside him. The officer gave a quiet signal. The ropes went taut. The first ship moved at roughly midnight. It didn't move easily. Nothing about this was easy. Despite the careful preparation, despite the greased planks and the specially constructed wooden rails and the windlasses positioned at intervals up the hillside to provide mechanical assistance. A Byzantine war galley, even a small one, stripped of much of its rigging and gear, weighed somewhere between 15 and 30 tons. Moving 15 to 30 tons of wood and iron uphill in total darkness on a surface that was slick with animal fat and sloped at an angle that made footing treacherous required something beyond engineering. It required the kind of collective human effort that happens when enough men are sufficiently frightened of the consequences of failure. The men who pulled the ropes were afraid of Mehmed. That was sufficient. The first ship came over the crest of the Galata Hill in the small hours of the morning, its hull groaning against the planks, its oars stowed inward, its mast removed to lower the profile against the night sky. The men guiding it used long poles to control the descent on the far side, leaning back against the weight, keeping the hull aligned with the track. Below them, the Golden Horn stretched black and still. The chain glittered faintly somewhere to the left. The sea walls of Constantinople were a darker darkness against the sky, dotted with the small, distant fires of the watch. The ship hit the water with a sound like a muffled thundercrack and a spray of white foam that the darkness swallowed instantly. Men waded in to stabilize it. Others were already bringing the second ship up the hill. This was the part that no contemporary account fully conveys. The sheer industrial rhythm of the operation, the way it became, over the course of that night, something almost mechanical in its repetition. Ship up the hill, over the crest, down the far slope, into the water. Move on to the next one. The windlasses creaked and the ropes sang under tension, and the tallow sizzled faintly against the friction of wood on wood. The bows groaned. The oxen, used for the steepest sections, breathed in great white clouds that the night air turned to vapour. Men who slipped on the greasy planks were grabbed by their neighbours and hauled upright without a word. There was no time for anything that wasn't the work. Zaganos Pasha's forces screened the entire operation from the eastern side, keeping any observer in Galata from getting a clear view of the hillside. The Genoese colonists of Galata were officially neutral. They had negotiated a position of non-belligerence with Mehmed at the start of the siege, and some accounts suggest they were not entirely uninvolved in the logistics of this night's work. Whether they actively helped or simply chose not to look is a question history has never satisfactorily answered. What is clear is that the operation proceeded without any warning reaching the Byzantine defenders on the opposite shore. By the time the sky in the east began to pale, somewhere between 60 and 70 ships were in the Golden Horn. Not massive warships. These were galleys, transports, horse barges, the lighter vessels of the Ottoman fleet, selected precisely because they could survive the crossing. But 60 to 70 ships were 60 to 70 ships. Mehmed had them lashed together in groups to form floating platforms and ordered artillery, smaller cannon and bombards mounted on the most stable of them. By the time the morning light was strong enough to see clearly, the northern harbour of Constantinople was no longer empty. The baker's apprentice on the sea wall saw it first, or someone like him did. The exact identity of the man who gave the alarm is lost to history, as the identities of ordinary men usually are. What survived was the alarm itself. The screaming, the bells, the spreading wave of incomprehension that moved through the Byzantine ranks like a physical force. Ships. Inside the chain. Ottoman ships. In the Golden Horn. Impossible and real, and already beginning to swing their guns toward the northern sea walls. The bells of Constantinople rang for 40 minutes without stopping. Constantine XI was on the western land wall when the alarm reached him. He had spent the night there, as he spent most nights, moving along the defences, speaking with the officers, checking the repairs to the sections that Mehmed's guns had damaged during the preceding day. He heard the bells, and he understood immediately what they meant, because he had always known this was the danger, had always known the Golden Horn was the soft place in the city's armour, had always been haunted by the question of how long the chain would hold. He rowed hard for the northern shore. What he found there was organised panic, which is to say, the Byzantines had not collapsed, had not fled, had not given up, but were moving in a dozen directions at once, trying to respond to a threat for which there was no prepared response. The northern seawall suddenly mattered in a way it had not mattered for 16 days. It needed defenders. Where were they going to come from? Every man he pulled from the land wall was a man who was no longer plugging a gap that Orban's guns were systematically trying to create. Constantine did the only thing he could. He divided. He pulled what forces he could spare from the quietest sections of the land wall and distributed them to the northern shore. He ordered Notaras to organize the Byzantine fleet, small, battered, undermanned, to contest the Ottoman presence in the harbour. He sent word to Giustiniani on the western wall that nothing had changed on that front, that the Genoese must hold, that the land wall was still the primary defence, that what had just happened was a complication, not a catastrophe. Whether he believed his own reassurance is something only Constantine knew. The Venetians and Genoese inside the city immediately began arguing about responsibility and precedence, who was obligated to defend which section under the terms of their respective arrangements with the Byzantine Empire. This was not cowardice. It was the grinding, bureaucratic reality of coalition warfare. The way that men who are genuinely brave and genuinely committed can still spend critical hours haggling over jurisdiction when the enemy is in the harbour. Constantine cut through it with direct orders. He had no time for anything else. Inside the city, among the civilian population, the effect of the morning's revelation was harder to manage. The Great Chain had been more than a physical defense. It had been a psychological anchor, the proof that something in the world was reliable, that the rules which had kept Constantinople safe for a millennium still applied. When ordinary people woke that morning to find Ottoman ships in the Golden Horn, what broke was not just military confidence. What broke was the assumption of order itself. If the chain could be bypassed, if the impossible could simply be done, quietly, in a single night, by a man who refused to accept the word impossible, then what else might be possible? What else might already be happening that they didn't know about? The churches filled. The priests prayed. The prayers, this time, had a different quality than they'd had in the preceding weeks. Less petitionary, more valedictory, as though the people making them were already beginning to say goodbye. But the walls still stood. The defenders were still there. Giustiniani was still on the land wall, and the guns had not broken through yet. There was still time, still hope, still the possibility that relief would come, that the Venetian fleet that had been promised for weeks would appear on the horizon and change everything. The defenders of Constantinople were not people who gave up easily. They had been raised on stories of miraculous rescue, of saints and emperors and divine intervention appearing at the last moment to save the city that God himself had supposedly designated as the new Rome, the second holy city, the place that simply could not fall. They still believed this, most of them. They just believed it a little less certainly than they had the morning before. 6 days after the ships appeared in the Golden Horn, Constantinople tried to burn them out. The plan was the work of the Venetians primarily, with Byzantine assistance. A night raid using fire ships, the ancient maritime weapon that had saved Constantinople from Arab fleets in the 7th and 8th centuries. Small boats packed with combustible material set ablaze and sent drifting into the Ottoman vessels anchored in the harbour. If it worked, it would eliminate the northern threat entirely and restore the balance of the siege to the pattern the defenders understood. Hold the land wall, hold the chain, wait for relief. The preparation was as secret as the Ottomans' hillside operation had been. Ships were loaded in darkness. Fire materials were assembled quietly. The attack was set for the hours before dawn. But the secret did not hold. Whether the information was sold to the Ottomans by Genoese intermediaries, whether Ottoman spies inside the city learned of the plan, or whether it was simply bad luck and coincidence, by the time the Byzantine fire ships moved toward the Ottoman vessels, the Ottoman fleet was ready. Cannon opened fire from the shore and from the floating platforms before the fire ships were close enough to do damage. The attackers found themselves rowing toward an artillery barrage in darkness, with flames reflecting off the water and making them visible targets while the enemy remained in shadow. The attack failed completely. Several fire ships were sunk or driven off. A number of Byzantine and Venetian sailors were captured. Mehmed had them executed on the harbour shore the following morning, in full view of the city's defenders on the northern sea wall, impaled on stakes in the brutal Ottoman fashion reserved for those who attacked the Sultan's person or property. The Byzantines responded by executing their own Ottoman prisoners on the land walls. It was an act of defiance that cost them nothing militarily and satisfied something deep and necessary in men who were being systematically destroyed from the outside. The stakes went up on the walls. The Ottoman prisoners looked out over their own army's encampment as they died. The mood inside Constantinople after April 28th was different from anything that had come before. Not despair, not yet, but something greyer and more fundamental. The hope that Venetian relief would come in time had not died, but it had become, for most people, a kind of professional hope, maintained out of necessity rather than conviction. The theology of miraculous rescue was still available, but it required more effort to access now. Giustiniani, on the land wall, was unaffected. He had always operated in the realm of logistics rather than hope. The guns damaged the wall each day. He repaired it each night. That was the job. He did the job. May arrived with the particular cruelty of a beautiful spring in a city that was being systematically destroyed. The weather had turned warm and clear. The sea sparkled. The hills of Asia, visible across the Bosphorus from the eastern walls, were green with new growth. Inside Constantinople, in the narrow streets between the inhabited neighbourhoods, flowers were blooming in the empty fields where neighbourhoods used to be. Outside the walls, 47 days of continuous bombardment had turned the western approach into a landscape of churned earth and rubble, where the thunder of cannon was as constant and familiar as the sound of the sea, something you stopped hearing individually and simply absorbed as background noise to your own mortality. By the first days of May, Orban's great basilica had fallen silent. The enormous cannon, the weapon that had been the symbol of Ottoman technological dominance, the thing that was supposed to end the siege quickly and cleanly, had cracked during a firing. The stress of 2 weeks of daily discharge had worked through the bronze, finding the hairline weakness that every foundry-cast weapon carries within it from the moment of its creation, and the barrel had failed. Orban was dead by then. He had been killed weeks earlier when a second, even larger cannon he was casting exploded during the pour, taking him with it. His assistants scrambled to repair the basilica with the materials on hand. By May 6th, it was operational again. The bombardment resumed with renewed fury. 9 substantial holes now existed in the outer wall, each one laboriously filled with wooden palisades and packed earth by Giustiniani's work parties, each one targeted again the next morning by the guns. The wall was no longer a wall in any architectural sense. It was a continuously regenerating wound, maintained by human stubbornness against mechanical force, enduring only because the men who repaired it each night refused to stop. Between May 16th and 25th, Ottoman engineers tried a different approach: mining. Tunnels were driven toward the wall foundations, designed to be collapsed at the right moment to bring sections of wall down from underneath. The Byzantines had anticipated this. They had a German engineer in the city, a man named Johannes Grant, whose specialty was counter-mining, and he had organized listening posts throughout the relevant sections of the wall, men whose job was to sit in silence with their ears to the ground, waiting for the sound of digging below. Every Ottoman tunnel the Grant's men found was countermined. Byzantine tunnellers dug to intercept the Ottoman workings, then flooded them, or smoked them, or collapsed them with small charges. Over the course of 10 days, 8 separate tunnel systems were neutralized. Not one of them succeeded in breaching the wall. The Ottoman attacks continued throughout May. Night assaults on sections of wall that the guns had weakened, sudden thrusts by Bashi Bazouk irregulars designed to keep the defenders constantly alert and permanently exhausted. Probing attacks at the Black-and-Eye Palace section at the northern end of the land wall. Every attack was beaten back. Every morning, the Ottoman flag was not on the walls. Every morning, Constantine walked the defences and spoke to his men. And the men who heard him speak said afterward,
that he had a quality in those days, a quality they struggled to name, something between resolution and grief, as though he had already understood the ending, but had decided to fight to it anyway, because anything less would have been a betrayal of everyone who had trusted him. On the evening of May 28th, the guns went quiet for the first time in 47 days. The silence was, in its way, more terrifying than the noise had been. The defenders knew what silence before an Ottoman assault meant. It meant the final assault was coming. Constantine ordered the church bells rung throughout the city. In the great Hagia Sophia, the cathedral that had stood for 900 years at the heart of Byzantine civilization,
its half-dome reaching upward in a geometry that architects for 1,000 years had called the closest thing to heaven's architecture that human hands could achieve. Every remaining clergy member gathered for a service. Every soldier who could be spared from the walls came. Every civilian who could fit inside the doors came. The liturgy that night was the ancient one, unchanged across 5 centuries. But the people performing it and the people hearing it knew with a certainty that settled in the chest like cold water that this was the last time it would be performed here, in this place, in this way, by these people. They sang the responses in voices that the stone walls absorbed and returned, and the sound that came back was both theirs and not theirs. Something older, something that reached back across every previous crisis, every previous near death, every previous dawn when the city had still been there, despite everything. After the service, Constantine went to the walls. He dismounted at the Black-and-Eye Gate and walked the length of the land wall on foot, stopping at each post, speaking to each group of defenders. Not a speech, something more personal than a speech, something more like a man who knows he is walking through a room for the last time and wants to remember the face of everyone in it. He thanked the Venetians, he thanked the Genoese, he thanked the Greeks who had stayed, the ones who had not slipped away in the preceding weeks, who had not found a reason to be somewhere else when the end came. He asked forgiveness for anything he had failed to provide. He told them that what they had done, holding this city for 52 days against the most powerful army in the medieval world, was already immortal, regardless of what happened in the next few hours. Then he went to the post at the Mesotacheion, where Giustiniani was, and they waited together for the Ottoman drums. The drums began at 1:30 in the morning, not gradually, not building from silence to sound. They began all at once, along the entire 4-mile length of the Ottoman line, a synchronized percussion that the ground transmitted as much as the air did, so that the men on the walls felt it in their feet before they heard it with their ears. With the drums came trumpets, and with the trumpets came the voices, the battle cry of 80,000 men, the combined sound of that many human throats opening at once, a sound that no living person had heard before and that would not be heard again, because armies of that size would never stand in a line and charge in quite this way again. The first wave hit the land wall at roughly 1:45 in the morning. Bashi Bazouk irregulars, the expendables, the men Mehmed used to tire the defenders before committing his better troops. They came in screaming, carrying ladders and grappling hooks, and the particular desperate energy of men who know that retreating from a sultan's assault carries its own death sentence. The Byzantine defenders on the outer wall met them with crossbow bolts and handgun fire and rocks, with arrows and Greek fire and the simple physical fact of gravity. A man on a 40-foot wall
has an overwhelming advantage over a man at the base of it, regardless of numbers. The Bashi bazooks swarmed the base of the outer wall, found no way through, and withdrew after 2 hours of fighting that cost them heavily and cost the defenders almost nothing. Mehmed watched from horseback in the middle distance, unmoving. The second wave was Anatolian regulars, better trained, better equipped, more disciplined. They arrived as the Bashi bazooks were falling back, stepping over their own casualties, filling the space the irregulars had emptied. They were given scaling ladders and specific orders to find the sections of wall most damaged by artillery and push through them. For an hour, the fighting at the base of the outer wall was severe, men pushing and hauling at the same sections of palisaded earth that Giustiniani's teams had rebuilt the night before, trying to tear through the makeshift repairs with their hands and their weapons, while Byzantine defenders above them poured down everything available. The outer wall held. By 3:30 in the morning, the Anatolians were withdrawing, and Mehmed sent in the Janissaries. This was what it had always been for. Everything that had come before, the bombardment, the fire ships, the ships over the hill, the 2 hours of Bashi bazooks, the hour of Anatolian regulars, all of it had been preparation for this moment. The Janissaries moved with the particular precision of men who have been trained since childhood for exactly this task. They came in silence after the chaos of the previous waves, and the silence was, in its way, more frightening than the noise had been. No screaming, no war cries, just the tramp of feet and the jingle of arms and the focused professional energy of the finest infantry of the 15th century hitting the most damaged section of the most defended wall in the world. Giustiniani was waiting for them. For 30 minutes, the wall held. The Janissaries came in organized formations, rotated fresh troops to the front to replace exhausted ones, coordinated their assault with covering fire from the artillery platforms behind them. Giustiniani moved along the Mesotachion without stopping, directing, stabilizing, doing what he had been doing for 52 days, turning exhausted men into a machine that performed beyond any reasonable expectation of its components. The Genoese professionals around him fought with the concentrated skill of men who had been fighting Mehmed's army for 7 weeks and had learned, through brutal repetition, exactly where to strike and when. Then a shot found its way through. The exact circumstances are recorded differently in different accounts. A crossbow bolt, some say, a handgun ball, according to others, the fragment of a cannonball. Whatever it was, it penetrated Giustiniani's breastplate and entered his chest. He did not fall immediately. He was that kind of man, the kind who processes injury as information before processing it as pain. He assessed the wound, assessed the situation at the wall, and then did something that every account agrees upon, though the accounts disagree completely about whether it was the right thing to do. He asked for the gate to be opened so he could be carried inside the city for treatment. Constantine, who was nearby, reached him as the request was being conveyed. The accounts say the emperor begged Giustiniani to stay, to remain on the wall, to let the wound be treated in place, to understand that his presence was worth 10,000 fresh men. Giustiniani, for the first and only time in 52 days of defending Constantinople, said he could not. The gate opened. He was carried through. What happened in the following minutes happened because of physics and psychology operating simultaneously and catastrophically. The Genoese professionals, who had been anchored by Giustiniani's presence, saw him carried away bleeding and made individual decisions that collectively constituted a collapse. Some held their positions. Most fell back toward the inner wall. The gap in the outer wall's defense, Not a gap created by artillery, not a gap created by assault, but a gap created by the simple fact of one man's removal was suddenly real. The Janissaries were through before anyone had time to close it. And then, while the Janissaries were pouring through the breach at the Mesoteichion and the defenders were rallying around Constantine to plug it, someone found the Kirko Porta. The Kirko Porta was a small gate in the wall of the Blachernai district at the northern end of the land fortifications. It had been used during the night for sorties, small raids outside the walls to harass the besiegers. And in the chaos and exhaustion of the final assault, it had not been locked. Whether this was accident or treachery is a question that has never been definitively answered in 5.5 centuries. In the context of the night, it barely mattered. What mattered was that a group of Ottoman soldiers, nobody agrees on how many, found the Kirko Porta standing unlocked, pushed it open, and walked through. An Ottoman soldier looked up and saw the gate. Then he shouted. Then his companions ran for the wall. 50 Janissaries scaled the outer wall at the Kirko Porta's location, almost unopposed, and raised the Ottoman standard, red with gold, on the tower above the gate. It was seen from all directions simultaneously. From the Byzantine defenders still fighting at the Mesoteichion breach, from Constantine and his personal guard, from the civilian population beginning to emerge into the streets, with the terrible curiosity of people who need to know if it's as bad as they fear. The cry went up from somewhere in the middle of the defending line, travelling in both directions along the wall at the speed of a scream. "The city is taken! The city is taken!" Constantine heard it. He looked at the flag on the tower. He looked at the Janissaries coming through the breach at the Mesoteichion. He looked at the men around him, his personal guard, a dozen Byzantine officers, a handful of Genoese and Venetians who had stayed when they could have left. Then he removed his imperial regalia, the purple cloak, the insignia that identified him as the last emperor of Rome, and threw himself into the breach. Multiple accounts describe what happened next. None of them agree. He was killed in the fighting at the inner wall, some say. He fell at the outer wall, others insist. One account has him surrounded and fighting on foot against a dozen Janissaries, going down swinging. Another has him simply disappearing into the crowd of fighting men and never being identified again. His body was never formally identified. He did not surrender. There is no account of his capture. The last emperor of Rome died at the Theodosian Wall on the morning of May 29th, 1453, in a manner that history, with perhaps appropriate symmetry, has declined to specify. By mid-morning, the Ottoman flag flew everywhere. The fires started almost immediately. 3 days of sanctioned looting, the traditional Ottoman grant to troops who took a city by storm rather than negotiation, began within hours of the walls being breached. By midday, smoke was visible above Constantinople from the Asian shore of the Bosphorus, from the hills of Thrace, from ships at sea who had no way of knowing yet what the smoke meant, but who would know within hours when the survivors began reaching the harbour. The streets of the city that had stood at the centre of the world for 1123 years were full of armed men moving between burning buildings, and the sound that came from those streets was the sound that civilizations make when they end. The numbers were what they always are after a siege of this kind: approximate, contested, enormous. Somewhere between 4,000 and 10,000 people were killed in the taking of the city,
depending on which source you use and how broadly you define taking. Tens of thousands more were taken captive, slaves primarily, the currency of medieval warfare, bound and marched to the ships and the horse lines in the long columns that the victorious always organize and that the defeated always become. The Venetian bailo, Minotto, who had commanded the Blachernai section, was captured and later executed. Many of the Genoese managed to reach ships and escape. The Venetian fleet at the harbour, what remained of it, cut its moorings and ran for the Bosphorus. Notaras, the Grand Duke, the second highest official in the Byzantine government, the man who had commanded the Golden Horn defence, was captured alive. He survived the fall of the city, only to be executed by Mehmed's order weeks later, in a dispute whose exact details different historians have reconstructed differently. He had been the last senior Byzantine official in Ottoman custody. With his death, the administrative continuity of the Byzantine state, however attenuated it had been in those final years, ended completely. Giustiniani reached the island of Chios. He died there within days or weeks, depending on the account, his wound having proven ultimately fatal. The man who had given Constantinople 52 additional days of existence, days that the city would not otherwise have had, died in a Genoese colony on a Greek island, not knowing whether the city had fallen before or after he left it, though he must have known, in the way that a specialist always knows, that the wall did not survive his departure by long. The eastern shore of the Golden Horn, the morning after the city fell, showed the evidence of what had saved it for 52 days, and what had ultimately undone it. The great chain still stretched across the harbour mouth, intact, unbroken, never successfully attacked. It had done its job perfectly. 70 metres to its north, scratches in the hillside above Galata showed where the wooden road had been. 3 miles of scored earth and tallow-stained plank, the ghost of the route that had made the chain irrelevant. The two things existed 50 metres apart, the defence that had worked and the solution that had rendered it obsolete. The Ottoman ships in the Golden Horn still floated. Their gun platforms, improvised from lashed-together hulls, were still in position opposite the northern sea walls. They had not, in the end, been the direct instrument of the city's fall. The land walls had broken before the sea walls had, and the Kirka Porta and the wound in Giustiniani's chest had opened Constantinople from the west, in the end, not the north. But their presence had forced the split of attention and resources that made everything else possible. They were the reason Constantine had been unable to concentrate everything on Giustiniani's wall. They were the reason the defenders had been exhausted from 2 directions instead of 1. 70 ships, 3 miles of greased planking, 1 night. Mehmed entered the city in the late afternoon of May 29th, riding slowly through the streets with the deliberate gravity of a man who had been rehearsing this moment since he was 13 years old. He went directly to the Hagia Sophia. He walked to the centre of the great nave, where the light came down through the windows in the half-dome in long golden shafts, and he stood there for a moment in what every account describes as silence. Then he picked up a handful of earth and poured it over his own head, the traditional Islamic gesture of humility before God, a reminder that conquest belongs to the divine and the conqueror is only the instrument. He declared the building a mosque. He renamed the city Istanbul. He declared himself Kaiser-i-Rum, Caesar of Rome, heir to the empire he had just extinguished. He was 21 years old. In the weeks that followed, refugees poured out of Constantinople in every direction they could move. Scholars, priests, artists, engineers. Men and women who carried in their memory, and in the manuscripts they had managed to save, the accumulated intellectual inheritance of a civilization that had been preserving ancient knowledge for 1,000 years, while the West was learning to read. They reached Venice, Florence, Rome, Genoa, Crete, and everywhere they went, they carried with them something that the scholars of Italy had been reaching for and half-glimpsing for decades. The full weight of Greek philosophy, Greek science, Greek art and literature in forms that the West had lost or never possessed. They brought Plato whole. They brought Aristotle in Greek. They brought manuscripts that Western scholars had known only in second-hand Latin translations. And the difference between the copy and the original was the difference between hearing a symphony described and hearing the symphony. Pope Nicholas V heard the news of Constantinople's fall and reportedly wept for hours. He called it a second death for Homer and Plato. He immediately began calling for a crusade to retake the city. The crusade never materialized. The calling for it did not stop for decades. The year 1453 arrived with three things happening simultaneously, and the combination of them is one of history's great convergences. Constantinople fell on May 29th. The 100 Years' War, 116 years of intermittent destruction between England and France, fought its last battle in July. And somewhere, in a workshop in Mainz, Johannes Gutenberg was finishing the development of his movable type printing press, which would be ready to produce its first complete Bible within the year. The old world, the world that had been building towards something since the fall of the Western Roman Empire 1,000 years earlier, was ending simultaneously from three different directions. By conquest, by the exhaustion of medieval dynastic warfare, and by the arrival of a technology that would make the old modes of thought and the old centres of knowledge obsolete in a generation. The fall of Constantinople was the most dramatic of these endings, and in some ways the most consequential. The Theodosian walls had stood for 1,000 years. They had been, for the entirety of the medieval period, the proof that the ancient world's engineering was superior to anything the present could produce, that the ancestors had built something beyond improvement, that the past was more formidable than the future. Orban's guns had refuted this proposition in 53 days. The lesson was not lost on any European monarch who heard the news. Within a decade, every significant fortress on the continent was being redesigned. Within 2 decades, the star-shaped bastion system, the Trace Italienne, had emerged from Italian military engineering as the answer to cannon. Lower walls, thicker walls, angled to deflect rather than absorb, backed by earthen banks, designed not to stop cannonballs, but to make sure they couldn't do decisive damage. The castle, as the Middle Ages had understood it, tall, imposing, a demonstration of wealth and power as much as a military instrument, was finished. What replaced it was functional, angular, expensive in a different way, and completely without grandeur. The age of the romantic fortress ended in the Golden Horn on the morning of April 22nd, 1453, when the sun rose over ships that should not have existed on that water. But the ships over the hill were not merely a piece of military innovation. They were something more philosophically significant than that. What Mehmed did on the night of April 21st was not unprecedented in the technical sense. The Avars had moved ships across land to enter the Golden Horn in 626 during an earlier siege of Constantinople. The Roman admiral Nicetas had done something similar at the Corinthian Isthmus in the 9th century. The Spartans, various Normans, and the Venetians themselves, who had moved galleys from the Adige River to Lake Garda in 1438, which was partly where Mehmed got the idea, had all understood that ships did not have to stay on water to be tactically useful. The technique was known. The knowledge existed. What made the difference on that April night was not knowledge, it was will. It was the decision to treat the word impossible not as a description of reality, but as a description of what other people expected. The chain blocked the harbour. Therefore, the ships would not go through the harbour. They would go over the hill. The logic was simple, almost childlike. The execution was extraordinary, and the result was that 70 ships appeared in the Golden Horn on the morning of April 22nd, and the city that had never fallen began, for the first time in its history, to understand that it would. The psychological impact of the ships was, in the immediate military context, arguably more important than their physical impact. The chain had not merely been a physical barrier, it had been a symbol of invulnerability, a concrete, visible proof that Constantinople was protected by forces that human will could not simply override. When the ships appeared inside the chain, the symbol shattered. The city that had survived 20 sieges had not survived them because of luck, or because God favoured it, or because the ancient engineers were simply smarter than anyone who came after. It had survived because its defenders had believed, with every fibre of their collective being, that the rules applied and the walls held and the chain stopped ships. Take away that belief, and what remained was 40,000 people, a few hundred professional soldiers, and 14 miles of crumbling ancient stonework. The Ottoman conquest of Constantinople is remembered primarily as a triumph of gunpowder, the moment when the gun rendered the medieval fortress obsolete, when the technological balance tipped permanently away from defence and toward offence. And it was that. Orban's basilica and its companion bombards were genuine game-changers, weapons that demonstrated conclusively that no static fortification could survive sustained artillery fire indefinitely, that the fundamental equation of medieval warfare, sieges take forever and usually fail, defenders have the advantage, was no longer correct. But the ships over the hill complicate that story. And in complicating it, they make it richer and more instructive. Because the ships were not a gunpowder revolution, they were a Stone Age tactic. Move heavy things on lubricated surfaces using human muscle and oxen. Applied with ruthless, imaginative precision to a problem that gunpowder alone had not solved. Mehmed used every tool available to him, without hierarchy or preference, without insisting that the newest technology was the only relevant technology, without allowing the grandeur of his great cannon to blind him to the small, grimy, animal fat and timber solution that turned out to be decisive. The immediate aftermath of the fall played out in ways that reshaped the world for centuries. The Ottoman seizure of the land routes between Europe and Asia forced European powers to find sea routes to the east. Portugal sent explorers down the African coast, reaching India by 1498. Spain funded a Genoese sailor named Columbus in 1492, who was still looking for a westward route to Asia when he ran into a continent that nobody in Europe had known existed.
The map of the world that Europeans understood in 1452 was unrecognizable by 1510. Not because of anything anyone had planned, but because Mehmed II had closed a door, and the people who needed it open had gone looking for windows. The Byzantine scholars who fled to Italy carried Plato's complete dialogues, not the fragments that medieval Europe had known, but the full text in Greek. The Florentine banker Cosimo de' Medici founded a Platonic academy in direct response to the arrival of these scholars. The Neoplatonic philosophy that emerged from this transmission provided the intellectual framework for much of what we now call the Renaissance, the revolution in art, architecture, science, and political thought that transformed Europe between roughly 1450 and 1600. The Renaissance was not caused by the fall of Constantinople, but it was accelerated by it, given a specific intellectual charge and direction by the surviving cargo of a civilization that Mehmed's guns had ended. Mehmed himself lived until 1481, dying at 49 while organizing another campaign. He spent the remainder of his reign consolidating Ottoman control over the Balkans, fighting Venice across the Aegean, and behaving in private like the intellectually omnivorous young man he had always been, collecting maps, patronizing artists, commissioning portraits of himself from Italian painters, building schools and libraries in the city he had conquered. He rebuilt Constantinople. He filled it with new populations drawn from every corner of his empire. He turned the Hagia Sophia into the greatest mosque in the Islamic world, and then built a new imperial mosque to outshine it. He was, in his complexity, exactly the kind of historical figure that defies the categories we try to impose on the past. Neither the monster that European Christendom insisted he was, nor the hero that Ottoman tradition made him, but something more human, and therefore more interesting than either. The Cercoporta, the small gate left unlocked on the morning of May 29th, was sealed after the conquest, and has never been opened since. It stands in the remains of the Blachernai Wall today, a small, unremarkable archway in a section of ancient stone that tourists walk past without knowing what happened there. The great chain of the Golden Horn is no longer there, but fragments of it are preserved in the Istanbul Military Museum, sections of massive iron link that you can touch with your hand, and which carry, in their weight and solidity, the memory of the engineers who built them, and the complete inability of iron and engineering to stop a 21-year-old who had decided that the impossible was simply something other people hadn't tried yet. The night of April 21st to 22nd, 1453, is the answer to a question that the medieval world never thought to ask. Not can walls be broken? Gunpowder answered that, slowly and expensively. Not can chains be cut? That was never successfully done. But can the premise be bypassed entirely? Can the defense that makes sense be simply walked around? Mehmed's answer was yes. His method was 70 ships, 3 miles of greased timber, thousands of silent men, and one man's refusal to accept that the geography of the problem determined the geography of the solution. Walk along the sea wall of Istanbul today, where the Golden Horn meets the Bosphorus, on a morning in April when the mist is still on the water and the light is the same pale gold it was 5 centuries ago. Look up at the Galata Hill. Find the line your eye naturally draws between the crest of the ridge and the water. That's where they came. That's the route of the ships that ended the Middle Ages. Not with thunder and gunpowder, not with a charge of cavalry or the breach of a wall, but with the slow, impossible, perfectly executed logic of a man who looked at an obstacle and asked a different question than everyone else had been asking. The walls stood for 1,000 years. The will to go around them took one night. Centuries later, the Hagia Sophia still stands at the center of Istanbul, its great dome reaching toward the same sky it has always reached toward. Christian, then Muslim, then museum, then mosque again. Each transformation a new argument in a debate that began on the morning of May 29th, 1453, and shows no sign of ending. Below it, the golden horn catches the morning light. The chain is gone. The ships are gone. The armies are gone. What remains is the geometry of the place itself, water and hill, and the narrow neck of land between them. The same geography that a young man once studied on a map in a tent outside Adrianople, and decided with the absolute confidence of someone who has never been told that some things simply cannot be done, that he could make it work.